Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Forbidden Trail.
I had heard about the Forbidden Trail since I was a kid. Everyone in our small town knew the legend. If you ventured too far into the forest, you'd never come back. As a child, I always dismissed it as just another ghost story parents told their kids to keep them out of trouble. But now, as an adult, the thrill of a dare was too tempting. It was late afternoon when my friends and I decided to tackle the trail. The sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. We laughed and joked as we entered the dense woods, trying to lighten the mood. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. The cheerful sounds of our conversation seemed to dissolve into the thickening silence. "Look at this," Danny said, pointing to an old, twisted tree. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Perfect place for a scare," I replied, trying to sound brave. As we continued, I began to feel an odd sense of unease. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the path ahead grew darker, despite the fact that it was still daylight. The air was heavy and stifling, as if it were pressing down on us. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. We were so engrossed in our conversation that we didn't notice the path starting to fade away. When we finally did, the laughter and light-hearted jokes came to a halt. The once clear trail had become a maze of tangled underbrush and unfamiliar terrain. "This doesn't look right," Sarah said, her voice laced with concern. "I'm sure it's just a little detour," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll find our way back." But as we pushed forward, the feeling of dread grew stronger. The trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, their branches weaving together to block out the waning sunlight. The path was now completely obscured. No matter which direction we turned, it seemed like we were walking in circles. "Hey, guys, is it just me or does it feel like the forest is changing?" Danny asked, glancing around with a frown. I looked around and saw what he meant. The forest did seem to be shifting, almost as if it were alive. The trees looked the same but somehow felt different, as if they were subtly rearranging themselves. "Let's just keep moving," I said, trying to sound confident. "We'll find our way out soon." But deep down, I couldn't shake the growing fear. The forest felt wrong, and the whispers of wind through the leaves sounded like something more sinister. I glanced back at my friends, their faces reflecting my own unease. We were alone in the woods, and no matter how much we laughed and joked, the feeling of being watched lingered like a cold shadow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I kept moving, determined not to let it show. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The uneasy feeling in my stomach had morphed into full-blown panic by the time twilight settled over the forest. The once familiar path was now a tangled mess of underbrush and shadowy trees. My friends and I stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights flickering in the encroaching gloom. We tried to stay together, but the forest seemed to conspire against us, guiding us deeper into its depths. "Where the hell are we?" Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. "This doesn't look like the same trail we came in on." "I don't know," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we need to find a way out before it gets completely dark." As we pushed on, the forest seemed to close in even more. The trees, once towering and distant, now felt like they were pressing in on us. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustling leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. It felt like the forest was alive, watching us. That's when it happened. Danny was the first to go. He had wandered a few feet off the trail to investigate a noise he'd heard, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I watched as he disappeared into the underbrush, calling out to him, but the forest swallowed his voice. "Danny, come on, man, this isn't funny," I shouted, my voice echoing off the trees. There was no answer. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. We called out for him, searching the area where he had vanished, but he was gone. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Panic set in. We tried to retrace our steps, but everything looked the same. The trees seemed to have moved, the path had vanished, and every direction led us back to the same spot. It was like we were caught in a maze with no way out. "We need to stick together," I said, trying to calm the others. "We'll find him." But the forest seemed to mock our efforts. We tried to call Danny's name again and again, but the only response was the eerie echo of our own voices. As night fell, the forest grew darker and colder. The once familiar sounds of the woods were replaced by an oppressive silence. The only thing we could hear was our own ragged breathing and the distant rustle of unseen things in the darkness. We huddled together, the fear and uncertainty palpable. I felt a deep sense of guilt and dread. Danny had gone off on his own, and now he was gone. The forest had taken him, and it felt like it was just waiting for us to be next. "We have to keep moving," I said, though I wasn't sure where we would go or if there was any hope of escape. The thought of Danny alone in this dark, oppressive forest filled me with dread. I could only hope we wouldn't suffer the same fate. The forest seemed to close in around us as we walked, every shadow and sound amplifying our fear. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching us, waiting. We pressed on, but the feeling of being hunted grew stronger with every step. As we continued, I could only pray that somehow, someway, we would find a way out before the forest claimed us as it had claimed Danny. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the more the night seemed to encase us in a suffocating embrace. The trees, once merely dark silhouettes, now loomed overhead like ancient, gnarled sentinels. Each step we took felt heavier, laden with the weight of the oppressive darkness that surrounded us. The silence of the forest was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the crunch of twigs underfoot. I kept expecting to hear Danny's voice, a cry for help or even a simple shout, but all that came back was our own anxious murmurs. I could feel the tension mounting among us. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes darting around nervously, while Mark was practically silent, lost in his own thoughts. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But as we continued walking, the sound became clearer, more distinct. It was a whisper, soft and elusive, just on the edge of hearing. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but they were indecipherable. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know." "It sounded like whispering," I said, trying to stay calm. "Maybe it's just the wind." Mark shook his head. "I didn't hear anything. But let's keep moving." We pressed on, but the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. It felt like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as if the forest itself was speaking to us. My heart raced as the whispers seemed to grow more urgent, calling out our names. "Help us! Don't go!" I tried to tell myself it was just our minds playing tricks on us, the forest exploiting our fear. But the voices were becoming increasingly distinct. They seemed to be repeating our names, pleading with us, their tone growing more desperate with each passing moment. "Is this some kind of joke?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Are you messing with us?" "No," I said, my voice cracking. "I swear I'm not." As the whispers grew louder, the forest seemed to shift around us. Trees that had been solid and unmoving moments ago now swayed as though alive. The path we were following seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways. It was like the forest was actively trying to mislead us, guiding us further into its depths. "Can't you see it?" Mark said suddenly, pointing to the shadows that seemed to dance along the edges of our flashlights. "There's something out there." I looked where he was pointing, but all I could see were the same dark, oppressive woods. My fear was mounting, and the whispers were becoming unbearable. It felt like we were being herded toward something malevolent and hidden within the darkness. We tried to stay close together, but the whispers made it hard to concentrate. Every shadow, every flicker of movement seemed to take on a menacing quality. It felt like the forest was alive, and it was determined to ensnare us. "Just keep moving," I said, trying to maintain control. "We need to find a way out of here." But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of the forest closing in on us. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, each one more frantic than the last. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and it felt like we were walking into a trap, with the forest as the cruel, unseen hunter. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale and terrified. We were trapped in a nightmarish maze, and every step we took seemed to draw us further into its nightmarish grip. I could only hope that somehow we would find a way out before the forest claimed us completely. As the hours dragged on, the oppressive darkness of the forest only seemed to deepen. Our sense of time had long since disappeared, replaced by the ceaseless whispers and the gnawing fear that we were being watched. We had lost all sense of direction, and every path we took led us further into the maze-like forest. The air was now thick and frigid, making every breath feel like a struggle. We stumbled upon an old cabin, its silhouette barely visible against the darkened backdrop of the forest. It seemed like an apparition, an ancient relic of a time long forgotten. Desperation made us cling to it like a lifeline. We decided to take refuge inside, hoping that it might offer some shelter from the malevolent force that seemed to be surrounding us. The moment we crossed the threshold, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. A shiver ran down my spine as I noticed the air growing colder, almost painfully so. The wooden floorboards creaked under our weight, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the cabin itself were alive. My flashlight flickered erratically, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. "Let's just stay here until morning," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay out there." We set up in a corner, huddled together as if our closeness might somehow protect us from the encroaching terror. The whispers outside seemed to grow more frantic, their tones rising and falling like the rush of a distant river. "That's not right," Mark said suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. "The whispers, they're coming from inside the cabin." I turned to look at him, but before I could respond, the sound of scraping metal echoed through the room. It was a low, grating noise that seemed to come from the darkness outside the window. I moved closer to the window, my heart pounding in my chest, but saw nothing beyond the oppressive blackness of the forest. "Guys, did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Before they could answer, a gust of icy wind burst through the cabin, extinguishing our flashlights. We were plunged into pitch darkness, and the fear was nearly overwhelming. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to turn it back on. When the beam finally flickered to life, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. Its eyes, or what I could make out of them, were hollow and dark, like deep voids that seemed to swallow the light. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it seemed to glide into the cabin with an unnatural grace. I could see it more clearly now, though its features remained obscured by the darkness. It was as though the shadows themselves were part of its being. Panic erupted among us. Sarah was crying, her sobs breaking through the oppressive silence. Mark backed away, his eyes wide with terror. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure approached slowly, its gaze fixed on us. The whispers had turned into a low, almost rhythmic hum, like a chant that filled the cabin with an eerie resonance. The temperature inside seemed to drop even further, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I grabbed Sarah and Mark, pulling them towards the door, desperate to escape. As we stumbled out of the cabin, the figure seemed to follow us, though it didn't move any faster. It was as if it were content to watch us struggle, a cruel spectator to our fear. We fled into the darkness, the forest now a labyrinth of twisted trees and shifting shadows. Every direction seemed to lead us deeper into the nightmare, with the figure's presence lingering just out of sight. It felt like the forest itself was closing in, tightening its grip on us. Our breaths came in ragged gasps as we ran, the whispers now a cacophony of voices shouting, pleading, and mocking. The oppressive darkness felt like a living thing, and every step we took seemed to echo with the hollow, mocking laughter of the entity that pursued us. In the chaos, I could only hope that we would find a way out before the forest, or whatever was haunting it, caught up with us. The entity had shown us its malevolent intent, and I feared that escaping its clutches might be impossible. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees and shadows, it had become a living nightmare. The figure that had haunted us in the cabin seemed to blend into the forest itself, becoming part of the darkness that surrounded us. With every step, it felt like we were sinking deeper into a pit of despair, and hope was slipping away like sand through my fingers. We ran blindly, our panic-fueled footsteps leading us through a maze of twisted branches and underbrush. The whispers grew louder, a maddening chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction. I could barely think straight, my mind consumed by the sheer terror of being hunted by an entity I couldn't even fully comprehend. "Keep moving!" I shouted to Sarah and Mark, though my own voice sounded distant and hollow in the oppressive silence. "We have to stop," Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. "We can't keep running like this. We need a plan." "Stop," Mark echoed, his face pale with fear. "What do you mean, stop? We need to get out of here." "We're not getting anywhere like this," Sarah insisted. "We need to find a way to confront whatever this is." Reluctantly, I agreed. We found a small clearing and collapsed onto the ground, panting and exhausted. The whispers continued their relentless assault, but they seemed more distant now, as if the entity was waiting, watching us from the darkness. "Do you remember anything about the legends?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "Anything that might help us?" I tried to recall the stories I'd heard as a child. The Forbidden Trail had always been shrouded in mystery, but one detail stuck out: a local legend about a spirit trapped in the forest, cursed to guard its secrets. It was said that the only way to escape its grasp was to confront it and make a deal. "There's a story about the spirit needing a bargain to be appeased," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's just a legend. I don't know if it's true." As I spoke, the figure reappeared at the edge of the clearing. It was more defined now, its dark eyes locked onto us with an unearthly intensity. The whispers grew louder, a deafening cacophony that seemed to reverberate through the trees. The entity was drawing closer, its presence pressing in on us like a physical force. "We have to try," I said, determination hardening my voice. "We need to confront it." With our flashlights flickering and our nerves frayed, we stood together in the clearing. The entity's form became more solid, its shadowy outline almost tangible. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a chaotic blend of words that seemed to demand something from us. "Who are you?" I shouted into the darkness. "What do you want from us?" The figure's form seemed to waver, and for a moment, it almost looked like it was struggling with something. The whispers turned into a low, mournful moan, and the temperature around us plummeted. "You seek to leave," the entity's voice finally came, not as a whisper but a clear, chilling echo. "To escape the forest's curse. What are you willing to offer?" I glanced at Sarah and Mark, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and resolve. "We don't have much choice," I said. "We'll offer whatever we can. Just let us go." The entity seemed to consider this, its form shifting and flickering like a candle in the wind. "Very well," it said. "But remember, bargains come with a price." The air around us seemed to crackle with energy, and the oppressive darkness began to recede. The whispers faded, replaced by a stillness that was almost peaceful in contrast to the terror we had experienced. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees moving aside to reveal a path leading out of the clearing. With a mix of relief and lingering fear, we followed the path, our steps quickening as we moved away from the clearing. The forest seemed to be releasing its grip on us, and the whispers were now a distant memory. As we emerged from the forest and back into the safety of the open air, I felt a wave of exhaustion and disbelief. We had escaped, but the memory of the entity and the horrors of the Forbidden Trail would haunt us forever. We had made a bargain with a malevolent force, and though we had survived, the cost of our escape was a burden we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. Looking back at the forest, I could see the shadows shifting once more, as if the trail was waiting for the next group of unwitting souls to stumble into its grasp. The forest had claimed its price, and we had been lucky to escape with our lives. But as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching us, waiting for its next opportunity to collect on the bargain we had made.
The sound of the waterfall.
I've always been drawn to nature, so when my friend Mark suggested a weekend getaway to a remote waterfall in the mountains, I was thrilled. It seemed like the perfect chance to escape the relentless pace of city life and immerse ourselves in tranquility. Mark had found this spot through an old acquaintance who swore it was one of the most serene and untouched places in the region. We arrived at the cabin on Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks. The last rays of daylight filtered through the trees, casting long golden shadows across the forest floor. The cabin was charmingly rustic, nestled in the middle of a dense woodland. It felt like stepping into a different world, far removed from the noise and chaos we were used to. As we unloaded our gear, the air was crisp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. The forest around us was a sea of green, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace as I looked around. We quickly settled in, making the cabin feel like home with a few personal touches and unpacking our supplies. That evening, we gathered around a campfire outside, the crackling flames casting a warm glow on our faces. We roasted marshmallows and shared stories, our laughter mingling with the gentle rustle of the trees. Mark's friend had mentioned some oddities about the area, strange noises and unexplained phenomena, but we dismissed it as local folklore meant to spook visitors. As night settled in, the forest grew eerily quiet. The kind of silence that seems almost unnatural. I noticed it right away, but I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, we were in a secluded spot far from the usual sounds of city life. Mark, seemingly oblivious to the quiet, continued to chat and joke as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Later, as I lay in bed, the quiet seemed to grow even more oppressive. The sound of the forest was replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed against the walls of the cabin. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I was eager to enjoy our weekend and didn't want to let a fleeting feeling of unease ruin it. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off. It was a nagging sensation in the back of my mind, like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. But exhaustion won out, and I finally fell into a restless sleep, hoping that the weekend would bring the relaxation we had been craving. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of leaves outside our cabin. The forest had taken on a new light with the dawn, and everything seemed fresh and vibrant. Mark and I quickly got ready for our hike to the waterfall, both of us eager to explore the area and enjoy the beauty of the untouched wilderness. The trailhead was a short drive from our cabin. As we began our hike, the forest opened up to reveal a trail winding through the trees, the ground covered in a soft carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. The path was well marked, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. We chatted about everything and nothing, our conversation blending with the natural sounds of the forest. The occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the distant calls of wildlife added to the ambience. I was so absorbed in the beauty of the landscape that I almost forgot the unsettling quiet of the previous night. After a few hours of hiking, we finally reached the waterfall. It was everything we had hoped for, water cascading down a rocky cliff into a sparkling pool below. The scene was breathtaking, and we spent a long time just taking it all in, snapping photos, and enjoying the serenity. But then, as we settled near the base of the waterfall for a break, I began to hear something peculiar. Amid the constant rush of water, there was a faint sound, a low, almost rhythmic murmur. It was so subtle at first that I thought I might be imagining it, but as I focused on it, the whispers grew clearer. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the forest, just beyond the reach of the waterfall's roar. I glanced over at Mark, who was engrossed in taking pictures. "Hey, do you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hear what?" Mark replied, not looking up from his camera. "That sound," I said, straining to listen. "It's like whispers or murmurs." Mark stopped and listened, but he shook his head. "I don't hear anything. Maybe it's just the way the sound carries." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to ruin the moment by dwelling on it. We continued to enjoy the waterfall, but the whispers persisted, growing slightly louder and more distinct as time went on. It was as if they were trying to reach me, drawing me towards something I couldn't quite see. As the sun began to set, we packed up and made our way back to the cabin. The whispers were still with me, their presence a nagging reminder of something wrong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, stayed with me as we left the waterfall behind. That evening, as we sat around the campfire again, I brought up the sounds to Mark. He chuckled and attributed it to the natural acoustics of the forest and the waterfall. "You're probably just hearing things," he said with a reassuring smile. "It's probably just the water mixing with the wind or something." I wanted to believe him, but the whispers from the waterfall were still fresh in my mind. As night fell and the campfire crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest around us was silent again, the same unnerving quiet that had unsettled me the previous night. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers from the waterfall seemed to follow me, haunting my thoughts as I drifted off to sleep. That night, I lay in bed unable to shake the eerie feeling that had clung to me since the waterfall. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden walls and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I tried to convince myself that the whispering I heard earlier was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind caused by fatigue and the unfamiliar surroundings. Mark had already fallen asleep, his even breathing a comforting but strangely incongruous sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with the day's unsettling events. The quiet was almost suffocating, and I found myself straining to hear any sound that could explain the whispers from the waterfall. As the hours ticked by, I began to notice a new sound, a soft, repetitive whispering that seemed to seep through the walls of the cabin. It was so faint at first that I thought I might be imagining it, but the murmurs grew steadily louder, coming from outside the cabin. My heart started to race as I tried to identify the source, but every time I listened more intently, the sound seemed to shift, always just out of reach. Unable to take it anymore, I decided to investigate. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Mark, and crept to the window. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the forest, the trees standing like dark sentinels against the night sky. I peered out, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The whispering continued, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps approaching the cabin. My pulse quickened. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The whispers seemed to grow louder as I moved toward the source of the sound. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense undergrowth and the twisted branches of the trees. I walked around the cabin, the beam of light flickering with every step. The whispering was now a cacophony of indistinguishable murmurs, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. My skin prickled, and I felt as if I were being watched by unseen eyes. The thumping sound grew louder, now echoing through the woods like a heartbeat. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash, and I jumped, spinning around to see what had made the noise. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness, shadowy shapes darting between the trees. I tried to follow them, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. Terrified, I stumbled back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to calm myself. I was certain I had seen something, but the forest outside was now silent again, as if it had swallowed up the noises that had so unnerved me. I crawled back into bed, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin and the distant sounds of the night. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of unease remained, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but the exhaustion from the previous night made me irritable and on edge. Mark noticed my mood, but attributed it to a restless night. I didn't mention the whispers or the sounds I'd heard. I didn't want to worry him or seem like I was imagining things. As we prepared for another day of exploring, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The whispers and the shadows from the previous night haunted my thoughts, and I couldn't wait to leave the cabin and the forest behind. But with each step deeper into the woods, I felt the ominous presence that had been following me, growing stronger and more insistent. The days following the unsettling night passed in a blur. Despite my efforts to act normal, the sense of dread lingered. Mark was enthusiastic about our hiking adventures, but I could barely focus on anything other than the oppressive feeling that had settled over me. The forest, once a picturesque escape, now felt like a trap, a place where something dark and malevolent lurked just beyond my perception. On the third day, we decided to explore a different part of the trail, one that Mark had heard about from a local. It was supposed to lead to an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a relic of a time long past. Mark was excited about the adventure, but I was filled with a growing sense of foreboding. The whispers and the shadows from the previous nights seemed to have seeped into my very bones. We set out early in the morning, the air crisp and cool. The forest was quiet as we walked, the only sounds being our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves and the occasional bird call. As we ventured deeper into the woods, I felt a growing pressure, as if the trees themselves were closing in on us. The path grew narrower and less distinct, the forest dense and claustrophobic. After several hours of hiking, we finally reached the old cabin. It was in a state of decay, overgrown with ivy and moss. The wood was rotting, and the windows were shattered. Despite its dilapidated state, There was something unsettling about it, as if it had been waiting for us. Mark, ever the adventurer, eagerly pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. I hesitated, my unease growing stronger. The interior was dark and musty, filled with old, abandoned furniture covered in dust. The air inside was stale, and the only light came from the weak beam of my flashlight. We explored the cabin, moving carefully through the debris. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every time I turned around, I thought I glimpsed a shadow moving just out of the corner of my eye. The whispers from the night before seemed to echo through the empty rooms, growing louder and more insistent. Mark was engrossed in examining an old, rusted stove in the kitchen area. I wandered into a small bedroom, where a broken bed frame and a tattered blanket lay forgotten. As I stepped closer, I noticed something odd, a small, dusty diary lying half-buried under a pile of debris. My curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up, brushing off the dust. The diary was old, its leather cover cracked and worn. As I flipped through the pages, I saw that they were filled with scrawled, frantic writing. The entries spoke of fear, isolation, and a growing sense of being watched. The last entry was particularly chilling. "They are here. I can hear them. They know I'm hiding." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced around the room, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more urgent, as if reacting to the diary. I wanted to leave, but Mark was still exploring the cabin, and I didn't want to alarm him without cause. I finally found the courage to approach him, my voice barely a whisper. "Mark, I think we should go. This place feels wrong." Mark looked up, a frown creasing his forehead. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I just have a bad feeling about this place," I insisted, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's get out of here." Reluctantly, Mark agreed, and we made our way back to the trail. The journey back was tense and silent. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to set. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, watching us from the darkness. When we finally reached the cabin, the relief I felt was palpable. Mark tried to cheer me up with jokes, but I was too shaken to appreciate them. The whispers from the night before had returned, louder and more insistent, echoing in my mind. As I lay in bed that night, I could hear the faint murmur of voices outside, mingling with the sounds of the forest. Sleep was elusive, and the sense of being watched grew stronger. The forest had become a place of fear and dread, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers and shadows had become a constant presence, and I was beginning to wonder if we had stumbled into something far darker than we had ever imagined. The night following our exploration of the abandoned cabin was the longest I'd ever endured. Sleep was impossible, my mind plagued by the whispering voices and the unsettling diary I'd found. Each creak of the cabin seemed amplified. Every rustle of the forest outside felt like a signal of imminent danger. I lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. As the hours passed, the whispers outside grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from just beyond the edge of the forest, creeping closer to the cabin. I could hear them clearly now, fragmented sentences and eerie murmurs that sent chills down my spine. I knew Mark was asleep, completely unaware of the terror I was experiencing. By early morning, I had reached my breaking point. Unable to stay in the cabin any longer, I quietly slipped out of bed and decided to investigate once more. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside into the cold dawn. The forest was eerily still, the whispers momentarily gone. I followed the path we had taken to the old cabin, hoping to find some explanation for the terror that had consumed us. The forest seemed different now, almost as if it were watching me. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the crunch of my footsteps on the forest floor. As I approached the old cabin, the sense of dread grew stronger. The whispers returned, but this time they were clearer, forming discernible words. I reached the cabin and hesitated at the door. The once creaky entrance now seemed to groan with a sinister purpose. With a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was still and quiet, the dust disturbed only by our previous visit. The diary I had found was still lying on the floor where I had left it. But something had changed. The air inside was colder, heavier, and the whispers seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. I approached the diary again, feeling a compulsion to read more. The final entry had been hauntingly accurate, describing feelings of being pursued and watched. As I turned the pages, I stumbled upon a hidden compartment beneath the diary. Inside, there was a small, weathered box. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a collection of photographs. They were old and faded, but I could make out faces. Faces of people who looked terrified, their eyes wide with fear. Among them was a photograph of a man I vaguely recognized from old local legends. I flipped through the photos, each one adding to the growing horror in my chest. The man in the pictures had a strange, almost otherworldly look to him, and in the background of one photograph, I saw the very same abandoned cabin where we were staying. I froze, a realization dawning upon me. The whispers, the shadows, the oppressive feeling, it was all connected. This cabin wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a place where something sinister had happened, something that had never truly ended. The people in the photographs were part of some dark event, and their terror had seeped into the very fabric of the place. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the cabin, and I jumped, spinning around. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, almost shouting now. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I turned to see nothing but darkness. Panicking, I struggled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers reached a crescendo, and I felt a presence closing in around me. In a frenzy, I grabbed the diary and the box, tearing out of the cabin and back into the forest. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going, just wanting to escape the oppressive force that seemed to be pursuing me. I finally reached the safety of the cabin, collapsing on the porch, gasping for breath. Mark came rushing out, his face filled with concern. I tried to explain, but my words were incoherent, my fear overwhelming. I could see the confusion and worry in his eyes, but there was no time to explain everything. We packed our things as quickly as we could and left the cabin behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest one last time. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of unease remained, haunting my thoughts. The experience left me deeply shaken, and the cabin in the forest has since become a dark memory, a place where reality and fear intertwined in ways I still can't fully understand. The whispers, the photos, the diary, they all pointed to something dark and ancient that had been lying in wait, hidden in the depths of the forest.
Woman of the Mist.
It was supposed to be a simple hike, a nostalgic trip back to one of our favorite spots from childhood. My brother Ethan and I had grown up in Asheville, North Carolina, where the dense woods and hidden trails were practically our playground. We'd spent countless weekends exploring the forest, so when we decided to revisit the old waterfall, it felt like a step back in time. The day was crisp and clear, a rare break from the usual autumn gloom. We packed our gear and headed out, excited to relive old memories. The drive was filled with laughter and jokes about how we used to dare each other to jump into the icy waters of the falls. The mist that hung low over the forest as we approached seemed to promise a bit of adventure, even if it was just a return to our past. The hike was easy, filled with familiar sights and sounds. We talked about our plans for the future and reminisced about childhood adventures. As we neared the waterfall, the mist grew denser, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. It was oddly beautiful, almost magical, but it also carried an unsettling quality, as if the forest was holding its breath. When we finally reached the waterfall, it was even more impressive than I remembered. The water thundered down with a powerful roar, the mist creating a shimmering curtain that obscured the view behind the falls. We both agreed that it was a perfect spot for some quiet time away from the world. Ethan, ever the more adventurous of the two of us, suggested we explore the area around the falls. I hesitated. The mist made the rocks slippery, and the area behind the waterfall was tricky to navigate. But Ethan's enthusiasm was infectious, and I couldn't resist the chance to share one more adventure with him. We made our way to the base of the waterfall, carefully stepping over the slick rocks. The mist was thick, clinging to our clothes and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Ethan was already several paces ahead, climbing over boulders and making his way toward a small, secluded area behind the falls. I called out to him, my voice barely audible over the roar of the water. He waved back, signaling that he was fine. I watched him disappear into the mist, feeling a pang of unease. The mist was so dense now that it felt almost alive, shifting and swirling around us. I carefully followed Ethan, my steps cautious on the treacherous rocks. The further I went, the harder it was to see or hear anything clearly. When I reached the spot where I had last seen Ethan, he was nowhere to be found. The mist had grown so thick that it was as if he had vanished into thin air. I called out for him again, my voice rising in panic. There was no response. The mist seemed to absorb my cries, and the roar of the waterfall was suddenly deafening. I stumbled around, trying to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same, endless white fog and the relentless sound of the falls. My heart raced as I realized Ethan was truly gone. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I pushed through the mist, desperately searching for any sign of him. The minutes stretched into hours, and the once familiar landscape had become a disorienting maze. When I finally made my way back to the trailhead, I was soaked through and shivering. My mind was racing with fear and confusion as I reported Ethan's disappearance to the local authorities. The search for him began almost immediately, but as the hours turned into days, hope seemed to slip further away. The mist that had once seemed enchanting now felt like a suffocating veil, hiding secrets that I couldn't understand. The legend of the Mist Woman that we'd laughed off as children now loomed over me like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every hope of finding Ethan. The days that followed Ethan's disappearance were a blur of worry, disbelief, and frantic activity. I spent every waking moment at the trailhead, talking to search teams and trying to hold on to hope. The local authorities, along with volunteers from the community, conducted exhaustive searches of the area around the waterfall, but every attempt yielded no trace of Ethan. The mist that had been so captivating now felt like an oppressive force, hiding the answers we desperately needed. Each day the search continued, and each night I would lie awake, haunted by the idea of Ethan lost and alone, surrounded by that thick, suffocating fog. The local news covered Ethan's disappearance extensively, and the story quickly spread through town. The community rallied around us, offering support and joining the search efforts. Despite their best efforts, the dense mist and treacherous terrain made it nearly impossible to find any evidence of Ethan's whereabouts. As the search dragged on, I began to hear whispers about the Mist Woman from locals. They spoke of a spectral figure who was said to lure people into the fog, causing them to vanish without a trace. I'd always dismissed these stories as mere superstition, but now, in the midst of our desperate search, they seemed to take on a chilling reality. One evening, while reviewing the search area on a map, I overheard an older man speaking to a group of volunteers. He spoke in hushed tones about past disappearances linked to the waterfall, recounting tales of people who had gone missing under similar circumstances. The stories were unsettling, describing how those who ventured too close to the falls would often hear whispers calling them deeper into the mist. I tried to shake off the fear that was creeping in. The idea of a supernatural entity seemed impossible, but the sheer number of disappearances and the eerie coincidences were hard to ignore. The legend of the Mist Woman was beginning to seep into my thoughts, making me question whether there was more to Ethan's disappearance than we could explain. One day, as I walked through the local library, I came across an old journal tucked away in a dusty corner. It belonged to a local historian who had chronicled various strange occurrences in the area, including disappearances and mysterious sightings near the waterfall. As I read through the entries, I found descriptions of events that mirrored Ethan's case. The more I read, the more I felt that there was something beyond mere chance at play. The historian's notes mentioned a strange fog that would sometimes envelop the area around the waterfall, making it almost impossible to navigate. The journal spoke of an old legend about a woman who had disappeared near the falls and was said to haunt the area, preying on those who ventured too close. It was as if the stories from my childhood were coming to life, and I couldn't escape the growing sense of dread. The search for Ethan continued with no new leads or clues. The local authorities were running out of options, and I could see the exhaustion and frustration on their faces. It was hard to remain hopeful as each day passed without any sign of my brother. The mist, once a mere backdrop to our adventure, had become a symbol of the unknown and the terrifying possibility that Ethan might be lost forever. Determined to find answers, I started asking more questions and digging deeper into the local folklore. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was a connection between the legend and Ethan's disappearance. But as I pieced together the stories and the clues, I was left with more questions than answers, and the fear of what I might discover grew stronger with each passing day. My obsession with the legend of the Mist Woman only grew stronger as the days went by. The more I learned about the eerie history surrounding the waterfall, the more I began to feel a deep, unsettling connection between these old stories and Ethan's disappearance. The notion that there was something supernatural lurking in the mist was difficult to accept, but it was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. I began frequenting the local library, scouring through old newspapers and records for any additional information. The historian's journal had been a goldmine of unsettling details, but I needed more. I spoke with locals who had lived in Asheville their entire lives, hoping to glean more insights or personal experiences that might explain the strange occurrences around the waterfall. One elderly woman, Mrs. Klein, who had lived in Asheville for decades, shared a story that chilled me to the bone. She spoke of a friend who had gone missing years ago while hiking near the falls. Her friend had described hearing faint, mournful whispers calling her name from within the mist before she vanished. Mrs. Klein believed the whispers were the work of the mist woman, a restless spirit said to lure people into the fog, never to return. I tried to remain skeptical, but as the stories accumulated, so did my anxiety. I felt as though the mist was no longer just a natural phenomenon, but a veil hiding something far more sinister. The more I learned, the more I realized that the stories weren't just legends, they were warnings. Determined to understand what was happening, I decided to visit the waterfall again. I needed to see it for myself, to confront whatever might be lurking in the mist. The search teams had long since abandoned the area, their efforts proving fruitless. The trail was now eerily quiet, with only the distant roar of the falls breaking the silence. As I approached the waterfall, the mist greeted me with an almost welcoming embrace. It was thicker than I remembered, wrapping around me like a cold, damp blanket. The sound of the water was deafening, and the visibility was almost non-existent. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I ventured closer, my flashlight cutting weakly through the thick fog. I made my way to the base of the falls, where I had last seen Ethan. The rocks were as treacherous as ever, slick with moisture and covered in a thick layer of algae. I carefully picked my way across them, the roar of the water and the oppressive mist creating a disorienting atmosphere. Suddenly, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint, whispering voice that seemed to come from all around me. It was a hushed, almost melodic sound, but the words were indistinct and incomprehensible. I froze, straining to hear more clearly, but the whispers faded as quickly as they had started. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. The mist swirled around me, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I called out for Ethan, my voice trembling with fear, but there was no response. The whispers started again, this time louder and more insistent. They seemed to call my name, coaxing me to move further into the mist. I fought the urge to follow the voices, knowing that doing so could lead me deeper into danger. But the compulsion was strong, almost overwhelming. I took a few tentative steps forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost make out the words. They were pleading, urgent, but still incomprehensible. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the realization hit me. These were not ordinary voices. They were something else, something malevolent. As I pushed through the mist, my flashlight flickered and died. Panic surged through me as I found myself engulfed in darkness. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that was even more unnerving. My breaths came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to find my way back to the trailhead. In the oppressive fog, every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a potential danger. My mind raced with fear and frustration. I had come to the waterfall seeking answers, but instead, I was confronted with a deeper mystery, a mystery that seemed to have no end and no escape. I finally made it back to the edge of the mist, my clothes drenched and my heart still racing. The whispering voices were gone, but the fear they had instilled in me remained. I knew I had to find out more, to understand what was truly happening in the mist. But with each step closer to the truth, the danger felt more real, and the chilling presence of the mist woman seemed to grow stronger. The more I delved into the mystery surrounding Ethan's disappearance, the more I felt that something beyond the natural world was at play. The whispers in the mist had left me shaken, and I could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow me everywhere. The idea that the mist woman might be real, and that she could have something to do with Ethan's disappearance, was almost too terrifying to consider. The local authorities had officially closed the case, citing a lack of evidence and the overwhelming dangers of continuing the search. But for me, the search was far from over. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to discover, something that might explain Ethan's vanishing and the strange occurrences at the waterfall. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the local historical society, hoping to find any additional records or documents that might shed light on the situation. The old building was quiet and musty, filled with artifacts and records from decades past. I spent hours combing through old maps, records, and personal accounts, trying to find something, anything, that could help me make sense of what was happening. Among the records, I found an old newspaper article about a similar disappearance that had occurred decades earlier. The article described a young woman who had vanished near the waterfall under mysterious circumstances. According to the report, she had been hiking with a friend when she suddenly disappeared into the mist. Her friend had heard strange whispers and seen shadows moving within the fog, but could not find her. The case had remained unsolved, and the woman was never found. The article also mentioned that some locals believed the waterfall was cursed, with an ancient legend about a spirit who roamed the mist, taking those who ventured too close. The description of the spirit matched the stories I'd heard about the mist woman. It was as if the legend and the disappearances were intertwined, creating a pattern that was impossible to ignore. As I continued my research, I discovered a local historian who had studied the area's folklore extensively. I reached out to him, hoping he could provide some insights. We met at his office, a small room filled with old books and maps. His name was Dr. Whitaker, and he had spent years researching the history and legends of the region. Dr. Whitaker was intrigued by my story and agreed to help me investigate further. He told me about the legend of the Mist Woman, a spirit believed to be the vengeful ghost of a woman who had died tragically near the waterfall centuries ago. According to the legend, she would appear in the mist, luring people to their doom with her mournful cries and whispers. Dr. Whitaker also mentioned that there had been several reports of people disappearing under similar circumstances, always involving thick mist and strange sounds. The common thread seemed to be the presence of the Mist Woman, who was said to have the power to manipulate the fog and create illusions to confuse her victims. We decided to conduct another investigation at the waterfall, hoping to find something that could help us understand the connection between the legend and the disappearances. Armed with new equipment, including infrared cameras and audio recording devices, we headed back to the waterfall, determined to uncover any evidence that might explain what was happening. As we approached the area, the mist was as thick as ever, wrapping around us and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The roar of the waterfall was deafening, and the eerie silence that followed felt even more oppressive. We set up our equipment and began recording, hoping to capture any unusual sounds or images. The hours passed slowly as we conducted our investigation. The mist seemed to shift and change, creating strange patterns and illusions that made it difficult to distinguish reality from hallucination. We heard occasional whispers and strange sounds, but they were always faint and indecipherable. As the night wore on, we began to feel a growing sense of unease. The mist seemed to press in on us, and the darkness seemed to come alive with shadows and shapes that moved just out of sight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still remained just beyond our grasp. At one point, I thought I saw a figure moving through the mist, a shadowy outline that seemed to be watching us. My heart raced as I called out, but there was no response. The figure disappeared into the fog, leaving me with an unsettling feeling that we were being watched by an unseen presence. As we wrapped up our investigation and made our way back to the trailhead, I felt a profound sense of dread. The evidence we had collected was inconclusive, but the experience had left me more convinced than ever that something supernatural was at work. The Mist Woman, or whatever presence was lurking in the fog, seemed to be growing stronger, and the danger was becoming more real. With each step away from the waterfall, I felt a sense of urgency and fear. The mist had revealed its power and its malevolence, and I knew that finding Ethan would require more than just determination. It would require confronting whatever dark force was hiding within the fog. The investigation had taken its toll on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the verge of uncovering something both profound and terrifying. Dr. Whitaker and I had collected hours of footage and recordings, but nothing concrete emerged. Yet, the sense of foreboding was undeniable, and the whispers I'd heard were etched into my memory. It was late into the night when I received a phone call from Dr. Whitaker. His voice was frantic, a far cry from his usually composed demeanor. He'd been reviewing the footage from our last visit and found something unsettling, a brief, shadowy figure that seemed to drift in and out of the mist. He insisted we go back to the waterfall, convinced we had missed something crucial. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I felt like a moth drawn to a flame, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. As we approached the waterfall once more, the mist was even thicker than before, swirling like a living entity. The roar of the falls was deafening, and the darkness felt oppressive. We set up our equipment, determined to capture something concrete. The mist seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, making the environment feel almost sentient. The shadows cast by our flashlights danced ominously, and the whispers, though faint, seemed to echo in the air. As the hours passed, I could feel the weight of the mist pressing down on us. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into near-total darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to keep my composure. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices calling out to us from beyond. Dr. Whitaker was adjusting the settings on the audio recorder when he suddenly froze. I turned to see him staring into the mist, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I strained to listen, but the roar of the waterfall drowned out most sounds. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard. It was followed by a series of harsh, raspy whispers that seemed to come from all directions. My skin crawled as the sense of being watched intensified. We both felt it then, the overwhelming presence of something ancient and malevolent. It was as if the mist itself had come alive, swirling around us with a predatory intent. I glanced at the infrared cameras, but the feed was filled with static and interference. A sudden, bone-chilling cold swept through the area, causing my breath to fog up in front of me. I looked at Dr. Whitaker, who was now visibly shaking. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the falls. Before I could respond, I noticed something moving in the mist, a figure, darker than the surrounding fog, that seemed to be gliding toward us. It was the same shadowy form I thought I had seen before, only this time it was closer, more defined. My breath caught in my throat as it emerged from the fog, revealing a face twisted in a grotesque expression of sorrow and rage. The figure seemed to reach out toward us with long, spectral fingers. I could see its mouth moving, forming words that were lost in the roar of the waterfall and the cacophony of whispers. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and I could feel its resonance in my bones. "Run!" I shouted to Dr. Whitaker, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the trailhead. We stumbled through the mist, our footsteps echoing eerily in the darkness. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more frenzied as we fled. We finally emerged from the mist, gasping for breath as we reached the safety of the trailhead. I looked back, but the mist had closed in behind us, hiding whatever presence had pursued us. The figure was gone, but the fear it left behind was palpable. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mist woman, or whatever force was lurking in the fog, was still watching us. The mist had claimed Ethan, and it seemed to be warning us to stay away, to leave the past buried and forgotten. With a heavy heart and a sense of unresolved dread, I knew that the search for Ethan might never truly end. The mist had revealed its power, but the answers remained elusive, hidden in the depths of the fog. As we drove away from the waterfall, I couldn't help but feel that the darkness we had encountered was far from over, that the mist would always be there, waiting, whispering, and haunting the edges of our lives.